speaking to you about the biblical usage of the words "the last days" and also the related phrase "the end of the world." If I can't go over everything again and lay the foundation that we've already laid, so if you need more information about it, go back and listen to the other messages that we've already presented on this. What we've seen so far is that the phrase "the last days" is a terminology used by Bible writers very clearly identifying the day in which they lived as the last days. It's very clear that the people who used those words as they were writing the New Testament referred to their own day as the last days. We've mentioned before that for us to appropriate that phrase and apply it to this day in which we live 2,000 years later contradicts and makes them seem as though they didn't know what they were talking about. Whereas the Bible writers did know what they were talking about. It's we today who say we're living in the last days who don't know what we're talking about. If we would merely read with an open mind what the text has to say, it would be very enlightening. We've also been talking about the phrase "the end of the world." I've pointed out to you that generally when that phrase is used, the word for world there is a Greek word aeon, which means the age, end of the age. The age which was ending, which was the day in which the Bible writers were living in the last days of that age, the age that was drawing to a close, is not the age in which we live today, but it was the age of the Old Testament, the age of a Jewish temple, the age of animal sacrifices, the age of a law of Moses. The new situation, the new covenant, which was coming into being, was inaugurated by the blood of Jesus. At the Last Supper, he took the cup and he said, "This cup is my blood of the new covenant," or the New Testament, shed for the remission of sins. A new covenant was established by the blood of Jesus. However, when Jesus was alive and when he did his redemptive work on the cross, Jesus was Jewish. All of his disciples were Jewish. They were all born under the law. The Jewish temple was still in existence, and it would remain in existence for a period, a limited period of time, a transitional period of time in which both systems were existing, we might say, side by side, the new covenant and the old covenant. The Jewish temple was still operating. They were still offering animal sacrifices. For 40 years after the sacrifice of Jesus came and fulfilled what the Jewish temple and its sacrifices were merely a picture of. Now, it's no secret if you read the Gospels that there was a tremendous amount of conflict between Jesus and the rulers of the temple and the rulers of the Jews and the Pharisees and the scribes. They rejected, by and large, Jesus, and he in turn pronounced judgment upon them. In Matthew chapter 23, at the very end of the chapter, Jesus leaves the temple after having a final confrontation with the Jewish elders and scribes and priests. And he says at the end of chapter 23, let's just back up a little bit. I think I'll back up not quite at the end. He has called them, he's pronounced woe on them. He said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees." He's called them whited sepulchres. He said, "You made the outside of the cup clean, but inside you're full of dead men's bones." And finally he says in verse 32, Matthew 23:32, Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you generation of vipers. How can you escape the damnation of hell? I would only stop and point out there where he says, "You generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell?" He means those people to whom he was speaking right then at that present time. The people, the leaders of the Jews, the rulers of Jerusalem in his day who rejected him. He says, "How can you generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell?" Verse 34, "Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues, and you will persecute them from city to city." Verse 35 says, "That upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." Now when he said this generation, he didn't mean some generation in the far-flung future, 2,000 years in the future. He meant that generation that was alive right then. Let me just read that one more time to you. That upon you. Now who is you in this sentence? The people he's talking to, the scribes and the Pharisees, whom he pronounced woe upon. That upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth. Now that is a pretty severe pronouncement of judgment, I would say. All the righteous blood shed upon the earth, he says, from the blood of righteous Abel, the first person murdered in the book of Genesis, clear back in the beginning. He says all the judgment for the righteous blood shed upon the earth is going to come upon this generation, not the one we live in, but 2,000 years ago, the one that Jesus was addressing. You see, they were living in a critical time. They were living in a time when the last representative of God under the Old Covenant was coming to speak to them. God had sent them prophets, God had sent them judges, God had sent them all kinds of messengers, and they had rejected every one of them. And they had slain the prophets, and Jesus is pronouncing that upon them. And He says, now, finally, the final messenger of God has come to the nation of Israel. Again, He's speaking to the nation of Israel, people under the Old Covenant. He says, upon you, those people to whom He was addressing, may come the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zacharias. Then He says, this generation, meaning the one then living, will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. Verse 37. All these things will come upon this generation, He says. Verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets, and stonest them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, but you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. Now He leaves the temple of God, saying to them, your house is left to you desolate. He doesn't even call it God's temple anymore. God has left the temple in the person of Jesus and abandoned it and turned His back on it, and the final judgment is about to fall, and He said it's going to, what did He say again? All these things shall come upon this generation. He doesn't specify a date or an hour or a time, but He says this generation is going to experience all this judgment I just got through talking about. And then as He leaves the temple, He says, your house is left unto you desolate. I say that you shall not see me henceforth till you shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Verse 24 starts, or chapter 24 starts this way. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came to Him for to show Him the buildings of the temple. In other words, they wanted to show Him, Jesus, look at these buildings that you just pronounced judgment upon. And Jesus turned to them and said, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. They pointed out to Jesus the magnitude and the beauty and the splendor of the temple He had just pronounced judgment upon. And He said, look at all these buildings, they said to Jesus. And Jesus turned around and said, you know what? You think it looks good now, it's going to all be thrown down. Not one stone will be left upon another. Now the thing about this is, the judgment that Jesus is talking about here is a well-attested historical fact. This pegs this event in history. We know exactly when this took place. This took place in 70 A.D., ironically, or interestingly, exactly 40 years from the time in which Jesus was crucified. One biblical generation, this judgment came, and the temple was thrown down, and not one stone was left upon another, just as He promised. He went on in verse 3 of chapter 24, as He sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto Him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Or as we've pointed out before, the end of the age. What age is ending? The age of the law, the age of the temple, the age in which the temple was the temple of God. It's coming to an end. And they ask Him, what shall be the sign of your coming? Now the rest, understand, as He begins to talk then in this Olivet Discourse, as we call it, He is addressing their question. All of those things are linked together, and they're all tied to an historical fact that we know about in history, in 70 A.D. He said to them, take heed that no man deceive you. Now who is you in this sentence? Well, you means the people to whom He is addressing, the disciples. He's not looking over their shoulders to a future generation, us for instance. He's not looking off into the future and speaking these words. He's speaking it to Peter, James, and John, and all of those disciples who ask Him, tell us, when shall these things be? He said, take heed that no man deceive you. You are those disciples who asked Him the question. He is addressing everything He's going to say here to people standing right in front of Him, who are alive as He's saying it. He says, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. What end is He talking about? Well, not the end of the world that we commonly think of, where the planet is destroyed. He's talking about the end of the age in which the temple, the Jerusalem temple, will be destroyed. And He says to them, take heed to yourselves that you be not deceived, and you will see all these things come to pass.